I still remember exactly how it felt when Brian Harper screamed at me to clear my desk in front of our entire finance department. All I had done was ask him to complete the vendor payment verification process I had implemented 3 years ago. That process had saved our company millions in fraudulent payments. But Brian saw it as unnecessary bureaucratic red tape. I stood there, frozen in humiliation, as my colleagues averted their eyes. I had no idea that within 2 weeks, this confrontation would lead to the most shocking boardroom scene in company history, completely transforming my career trajectory. Working at Westfield Technologies had been my dream job for the past 5 years. As the senior financial controls manager, I had built my reputation on attention to detail and unwavering integrity. At 32 years old, I had finally found my professional home, a place where my analytical mind and cautious nature were valued rather than dismissed. The path to my position hadn't been easy. After graduating with my accounting degree, I bounced between several companies that didn't appreciate thoroughness, calling me too careful or nitpicky. But Westfield was different from the moment I interviewed. The then CFO, Martin Reynolds, a distinguished man with kind eyes and silver hair, had leaned forward during my interview and said, "Tanya, tell me about a time you refused to cut corners despite pressure." That question told me everything I needed to know about the company's values. Westfield Technologies developed software for healthcare systems, which meant our work literally impacted patient care. With over 500 employees and growing, we were hitting that awkward middle stage between startup energy and corporate structure. Many of our processes were still catching up to our size, which created the perfect environment for my particular skills. My defining moment came 3 years ago. While reviewing a batch of vendor payments, I noticed small irregularities in invoices from a company called Integrated Medical Solutions. Most people would have missed them: slightly different fonts, inconsistent spacing, minor variations in the logo. I flagged them for investigation and discovered a sophisticated fraud scheme that had already cost Westfield nearly $400,000. Someone had been intercepting legitimate vendor emails and replacing banking information with their own accounts. When I presented my findings to Jessica Winters, our CEO, she was simultaneously horrified and impressed. Jessica was everything you'd want in a leader: brilliant, decisive, and genuinely concerned with running an ethical company. She had built Westfield from nothing 10 years ago, and still maintained the vision and energy of a founder. "We need a system," Jessica had said, pacing her office. "This can never happen again." "What do you recommend, Tanya?" That conversation led to my proudest professional achievement, a comprehensive payment verification system that required multiple checkpoints before any vendor payment over $5,000 could be released. Yes, it added steps to our process. Yes, some departments grumbled about delays, but the system worked flawlessly, catching 6 more attempted frauds over the next 3 years and saving the company millions. My team of 4 financial analysts embraced the process, though they sometimes teased me about my meticulousness. "Tanya doesn't trust anyone," joked Zach Thompson, my youngest team member with perpetually untamed hair and brilliant analytical skills. But the ribbing came with respect. They knew I was protecting the company. Some colleagues nicknamed me the guardian of the treasury, which I secretly loved. Others viewed me as an obstacle to efficiency. The sales team, always eager to please new clients, found my verification requirements particularly frustrating. But Jessica and Martin always backed me up when conflicts arose. "Better a day late than a dollar missing," Martin would say in meetings when anyone complained about financial controls. His support made it possible for me to do my job effectively. The company culture at Westfield struck a delicate balance. We valued innovation and quick response to market needs, but we had embraced necessary safeguards. I took immense pride in protecting the company while maintaining positive vendor relationships. Our legitimate vendors appreciated our thoroughness. Once they understood it, meant they would always be paid correctly and on time. Life at Westfield felt stable and purposeful. My team functioned like a well-oiled machine. Martin mentored me on the finer points of corporate finance. Jessica continued to recognize my contributions during quarterly all-hands meetings. I even started teaching a section on financial ethics in our new employee orientation. Then came the announcement that shattered our comfortable routine. It happened during what should have been an ordinary Monday morning meeting. Jessica called the finance department together, her expression unusually somber. "I have difficult news," she began, her voice slightly strained. "Martin has informed me that he needs to retire immediately due to health concerns." The room fell completely silent. Martin was only 59, nowhere near retirement age. He had been the financial backbone of Westfield since its early days. Martin stood, looking pale but composed. "I've recently received a diagnosis that requires my full attention," he explained without specifics. "I've loved working with all of you, but my doctors are insistent that I reduce stress immediately." I felt a cold wave of concern wash over me. Martin had been more than my boss. He was my advocate, my mentor, the executive who understood why financial controls mattered. Without him, who would champion the systems I had built? Jessica continued with forced brightness. "We've already begun the search for a new CFO. In the meantime, I'll be overseeing the finance department directly." After the meeting, I tried to speak with Martin privately, but the crowd of well-wishers made it impossible. He caught my eye across the room, giving me a reassuring nod that somehow didn't reassure me at all. 2 weeks later, Jessica announced our new CFO, Brian Harper, a financial turnaround specialist from Redwood Systems, a company 3 times our size. His credentials looked impressive on paper: MBA from Wharton, history of cost-cutting initiatives, speaker at financial leadership conferences. "Brian will help take Westfield to the next level," Jessica told us, standing beside a tall man with perfectly coiffed dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "His expertise in streamlining financial operations is exactly what we need for our growth phase." I should have recognized the warning signs in that very first introduction. But instead, I smiled politely and prepared to welcome our new leader, completely unaware that my professional life was about to implode. Brian Harper arrived at Westfield Technologies with the confident stride of someone who already owned the place. During his first week, he scheduled individual meetings with all department heads and senior managers, a promising start that made me hopeful about our future working relationship. My meeting, however, was scheduled for Friday at 4:30 in the afternoon, a time slot that didn't exactly communicate priority. When I arrived at his office, Brian was engaged in what seemed like a personal call, laughing loudly while gesturing for me to wait outside. After 10 minutes, he waved me in without ending his conversation. "Yeah, we'll golf Sunday." "Looking forward to it," he said before finally hanging up. "Tanya Williams, right?" he asked, not quite making eye contact as he shuffled papers on his desk. "Tanya Wilson," I corrected gently. "Senior Financial Controls Manager." Right. He nodded dismissively. "So you're the one with all the checklists." That single comment immediately set the tone for our relationship. In Brian's world, financial controls weren't safeguards, they were bureaucratic obstacles. I tried to give him context. "I'd love to walk you through our verification systems and show you the fraud attempts we've caught." "I'm sure it's all very thorough," he interrupted, checking his watch. "Look, I've reviewed the finance department processes, and between us, there's significant room for streamlining. Companies like Westfield often develop excessive caution that hampers growth. Our systems have actually saved the company. Times change, Tanya. Methods that worked when Westfield was smaller won't serve us going forward. We need agility, not red tape." He stood up, effectively ending our 15-minute meeting. "Send me your process documents. I'll review them when I can." I left his office feeling dismissed and concerned. Brian had made up his mind without even understanding what we did or why we did it. Over the next 3 weeks, I attempted to schedule follow-up meetings with Brian, but he consistently canceled at the last minute with vague explanations about executive priorities. Meanwhile, he was making his presence felt throughout the company, holding long lunches with the sales team and closed-door sessions with Jessica. The first real conflict erupted 4 weeks after Brian's arrival. I received an urgent payment request for a company called Velocity Digital, a new vendor I'd never seen before, with instructions to process a $50,000 deposit immediately. The request came directly from Brian's email with no supporting documentation, no completed vendor verification form, and no signed contract that I could locate. Following our standard protocol, I sent Brian a polite email explaining the verification requirements and attached our vendor onboarding forms. His response came within minutes. "This is a strategic partner. Process the payment today. Paperwork can follow." My stomach tightened. This was exactly the kind of situation our controls were designed to prevent. I crafted a careful response, explaining that I couldn't process the payment without at least basic verification, and offered to expedite the process if he could provide the minimum required documentation. Instead of responding to my email, Brian appeared at my desk 30 minutes later, clearly irritated. "Is there a problem with the Velocity Digital payment?" he asked loudly enough that my entire team looked up from their work. "No problem," I said, keeping my voice even. "I just need the verification documents before processing. Tanya, I'm the CFO. I've verified this vendor personally. That should be sufficient." I felt trapped between protocol and authority. "I understand, but our payment system requires specific documentation for audit purposes. It's actually not possible to bypass those fields in the system." This wasn't entirely true. There was an override function, but it existed for corrections, not for skipping verification entirely. Brian's expression hardened. "Find a way to make it work. This is a time-sensitive business opportunity that Jessica supports. I don't want to hear that we lost it because of paperwork." He walked away before I could respond, leaving me with an impossible choice. Ultimately, I processed the payment after creating minimum documentation myself, and noting in our records that the standard verification had been bypassed at the CFO's insistence. It felt wrong, but I told myself it was a one-time exception. It wasn't. Over the next 2 months, Brian bypassed our verification processes 6 more times, each instance for new vendors with vague service descriptions and urgent timelines. I began documenting every irregular approval, keeping copies of all communications. Something didn't feel right, but I had no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, just processes being ignored by someone with the authority to ignore them. I tried raising my concerns with other executives, but no one wanted to challenge the new CFO. Derek from sales said, "Brian's bringing in fresh energy. Maybe your processes are a bit excessive." Linda from operations suggested, "Give him time to adjust to our culture." Even Andrea Fuller in human resources, usually an ally, advised patience. New leaders often test boundaries while establishing their approach. Meanwhile, Brian began excluding me from financial strategy meetings where I'd previously been a key participant. When I asked why, he explained that he was streamlining attendance to enhance productivity corporate speak for "I don't want you there." The situation escalated when Brian brought in Scott Williams, introducing him as a financial efficiency consultant who would be reviewing all department processes. Scott, a man with slicked-back blonde hair and an aggressive handshake, had worked with Brian at his previous company. "Scott's going to help us identify opportunities for modernization," Brian announced in an email to the finance team. The subtext was clear. Change was coming, whether we wanted it or not. One evening, while working late to catch up on the verifications Brian had bypassed, I overheard voices from the CFO's office. The door was ajar, and Brian and Scott clearly didn't realize anyone was still on the floor. "These processes are prehistoric," Scott was saying. "Especially that verification system. It's killing our velocity." "Tell me about it," Brian replied. "The guardian of the treasury is more like the warden of bureaucracy." But don't worry. We're going to modernize these dinosaur processes one way or another. I stepped away, my face burning with anger and humiliation. They were dismissing years of careful work without even understanding its purpose or value. The final straw came when I discovered that Brian had secretly approved a $2.8 million contract with a company called Data Sync Solutions without any verification whatsoever. I only learned about it when their implementation team showed up on site and needed access to our systems. The project manager casually mentioned the contract amount, leaving me speechless. When I searched our records, I found no trace of DataSync in our vendor database, no verification documents, and no payment requisition through normal channels. Yet somehow, they had received an initial payment of $800,000. The money had been categorized as strategic technology investment with Brian as the sole approver. This wasn't just bypassing protocol. It was deliberately hiding a massive expenditure from the very department responsible for financial oversight. I knew then that I needed to take action, even if it meant risking my position. What I didn't know was just how quickly everything would unravel. The discovery of the hidden DataSync contract left me reeling. $2.8 million represented nearly 20% of our annual technology budget, and it had been committed without any of the usual evaluations, competitive bids, or security assessments. As I dug deeper, the situation appeared increasingly suspicious. I compiled everything I could find related to DataSync, the limited documentation available, email threads mentioning the project, and a timeline of when they first appeared in our systems. Then I reached out to Andrea Fuller, our HR director, requesting a confidential meeting. Andrea had been with Westfield almost as long as I had. With her practical approach and commitment to company values, I hoped she would see the seriousness of the situation. We met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the office to avoid office gossip. "This is troubling," Andrea admitted after reviewing my documentation. "But Brian is still new, Tanya. Maybe he just doesn't understand our processes yet. It's been 3 months," I pointed out. "And this isn't about process anymore. He deliberately concealed a massive expenditure. Doesn't that concern you?" Andrea sighed, stirring her latte. "Of course it does. But Jessica has given him full authority to reorganize finance. She's focused on our expansion into the West Coast market and trusts him to handle operations." "Has anyone vetted DataSync thoroughly?" I asked. "Do we know anything about their track record?" "I assume Brian did his due diligence," she replied, though her expression suggested she shared my doubts. "Give me some time, Tanya. Let me see what I can find out discreetly. In the meantime, try to work with Brian, not against him. Maybe approach this as helping him understand our culture better." I left feeling frustrated but slightly hopeful that Andrea would take my concerns seriously. That hope faded quickly over the next 2 weeks, as DataSync began missing implementation deadlines while simultaneously submitting invoices for additional consulting services not covered in the original contract. When I attempted to review these invoices, Scott Williams intercepted them, telling me, "Brian will handle all DataSync financial matters directly." My concern turned to alarm when I began researching DataSync online. They had only been in business for 3 years, and I found several complaints on industry forums about missed deadlines, scope creep, and aggressive billing practices. When I brought these findings to Brian, he dismissed them outright. "Internet complaints are meaningless," he said with a wave of his hand. "Disgruntled former employees, competitors trying to cause trouble. DataSync came highly recommended by my network." That was exactly what worried me. Whose network? Who was benefiting from this arrangement? The situation reached a breaking point when Brian announced a company-wide financial streamlining initiative that would eliminate several control processes, including my vendor verification system. The announcement came via email on a Tuesday morning, with implementation scheduled for the following Monday. No discussion, no transition period, just a unilateral decision. I spent 2 days preparing a detailed presentation showing the risks of eliminating these controls and documenting the fraud attempts we had caught. On Thursday, I requested 10 minutes at the finance department meeting to share my analysis. 5 minutes, Brian conceded reluctantly. The meeting room was packed with the entire finance team, plus Scott Williams and 2 people from the DataSync implementation team who had no clear reason to be there. I connected my laptop to the projector and began my carefully prepared presentation. Over the past 3 years, our verification processes have prevented 9 fraud attempts, totaling approximately $2.7 million. I began, showing a graph of the incidents. The controls we've implemented serve as— We get it, Tanya, Brian interrupted. Fraud bad, controls good. But controls also slow down business operations and create unnecessary work. With respect, I continued, I'd like to show the minimal impact on processing time compared to the financial risk. The decision has been made. Brian cut me off again. Westfield isn't the same company it was 3 years ago. We need to operate at the speed of modern business, not bogged down in paperwork. I noticed several team members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but no one spoke up. I tried one more approach. Could we consider maintaining verification for payments above a certain threshold? That would balance efficiency with protection for larger transactions. Brian's face hardened. Your methods are obsolete, Tanya. We're moving forward with streamlined processes better suited to our growth objectives. That's final. He moved on to the next agenda item, effectively dismissing both me and my concerns. After the meeting, several colleagues gave me sympathetic glances, but kept their distance. The message was clear. Brian had the power, and opposing him was dangerous. That afternoon, I received an urgent email from DataSync requesting an emergency implementation fee of $350,000. The justification cited unforeseen system compatibility issues requiring specialized resources. It was exactly the kind of vague, unexpected charge that our verification process was designed to scrutinize. The request had been sent to both Brian and me, probably because DataSync's finance department had my contact information from earlier correspondence. Before Brian could intervene, I replied to all, attaching our verification requirements and requesting detailed documentation of the unforeseen issues, including hours worked, personnel involved, and specific technical challenges encountered. I also noted that any substantial change to the contract scope would require review and approval following our change management procedures. It was a by-the-book response, professional and reasonable. The following morning, I arrived early to find Brian waiting by my desk, his face flushed with anger. As soon as I approached, he launched into a tirade loud enough for everyone arriving to hear. "Who do you think you are?" he demanded. "You've been undermining me since day one with your obsession with rules and paperwork." I tried to keep my voice calm. "I'm just following our established procedures, Brian. Major contract changes require proper documentation. I don't need your checklist," he snapped, slapping a folder onto my desk. "You've become an obstacle to progress, questioning decisions above your pay grade and delaying critical business initiatives." By now, the entire department had fallen silent, watching the confrontation unfold. My heart pounded in my chest, but I stood my ground. "I'm trying to protect the company," I said. "These procedures exist for good reasons." Brian's voice dropped to a dangerous level. "Not anymore. Clear your desk, Tanya. You're fired. Effective immediately. I'll have security escort you out." The words hit me like a physical blow. 5 years of dedicated work, ending like this, publicly humiliated in front of my colleagues. "On what grounds?" I managed to ask. "Insubordination. Failure to adapt to changing business needs. Take your pick." He turned to address the stunned onlookers. "Let this be a lesson about the direction this company is moving. We value team players who embrace change, not bureaucrats who cling to outdated methods. 2 security guards appeared at the department entrance. Brian had planned this ambush. With as much dignity as I could muster, I gathered my personal items into a cardboard box, while my colleagues averted their eyes. No one dared speak up as I was escorted from the building, my access badge confiscated like I was a criminal. As the doors closed behind me, I stood in the parking lot clutching my box, overwhelmed by shock and the sudden, terrible question, what do I do now? The first few days after my termination passed in a blur of shock, shame, and anger. I alternated between compulsively checking my email for messages from colleagues that never came and staring blankly at job search websites. Each night, I replayed the public humiliation in my mind, imagining all the things I should have said or done differently. The silence from my former colleagues was deafening. People I had worked alongside for years, shared lunches with, celebrated birthdays with, all of them vanished, as if I'd never existed. I understood their fear. They had witnessed firsthand what happened to those who crossed Brian Harper. On the 4th day, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was Zach Thompson, the youngest analyst from my team, calling from outside the office. Tanya? Are you okay? I'm so sorry about what happened, he said, his voice low, as if he feared being overheard. I'm managing, I replied, surprised at the emotion that welled up at hearing a friendly voice. How are things there? Chaotic, Zach said. Brian pushed through all his changes the same day you left. No transition, no training. Nobody knows what they're doing. He paused before adding, and that data sync payment you questioned? It was processed within hours of your departure. No verification, no documentation. My stomach tightened. What about the rest of the team? Everyone's walking on eggshells. Scott Williams has basically taken over your role, but he doesn't understand our systems. He's just rubber stamping whatever Brian wants. Zach lowered his voice further. I think something really wrong is happening, Tanya, but nobody dares question anything after what happened to you. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, torn between the practical need to move on with my career and a nagging sense that I couldn't just walk away. Westfield had been more than a job to me. I had helped build its financial safeguards from the ground up. The thought of Brian and Scott dismantling everything made me physically ill. The next morning, my email inbox contained a surprise. Messages from 3 different vendors, expressing concern about my departure and delayed payments. Word had apparently spread through the vendor community that I was no longer with Westfield. One email particularly caught my attention, from Lucas Montgomery, CEO of Montgomery Systems, one of our largest and most reputable technology partners. Tanya, I was disturbed to hear about your sudden departure from Westfield. Our accounting department has been trying to reach someone about our outstanding invoices with no success. Could we speak at your convenience? Regards, Lucas. I had always maintained excellent relationships with our legitimate vendors, and Lucas had been a particularly strong partner during a system implementation 2 years earlier. I called him immediately. Tanya, thank you for getting back to me, Lucas said when we connected. First, I want to say that whatever happened at Westfield, I've always found your work to be exemplary. Our team actually uses your verification process as an example of best practices when onboarding new clients. His words were a balm to my bruised professional ego. Thank you, Lucas. That means a lot right now. As for our situation, we haven't received payment for the last 3 months of services. When we finally reached someone in accounts payable, they said all payments are under review by the new financial consultant. Do you know anything about this? I explained what had happened, keeping to the facts without editorializing. Lucas listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions. This Data Sync Solutions, he said when I finished. The name sounds familiar. I heard keyboard clicks in the background. Ah, here it is. They approached us last year about a partnership, but our due diligence raised several red flags. They have a pattern of overpromising, under-delivering, and then charging substantial fees to fix the problems they created. My pulse quickened. Did you happen to deal with anyone named Richard Webb? Yes. He's the founder. Smooth talker. Great at making big promises. Lucas paused. How did you know that name? Just something I overheard, I said, not wanting to reveal my suspicions without more evidence. Lucas, do you know if DataSync has any connection to Brian Harper, our new CFO? The line went quiet for a moment. I can't say for certain. But there were rumors in the industry about Richard Webb having friends in financial positions at several companies where DataSync mysteriously won contracts without competitive bidding. More keyboard clicks. Give me a few days. I might be able to find out more through my network. After our call, I felt energized for the first time since my termination. I wasn't crazy. Something genuinely suspicious was happening, and I now had external confirmation that DataSync's practices were questionable at best. I decided to conduct my own investigation. Using my personal laptop, I created a spreadsheet documenting everything I knew about Brian's arrival, the irregular vendor approvals, the DataSync contract, and the timeline of my firing. Then I began researching Brian Harper's career history before Westfield. What I discovered sent a chill down my spine. Brian had worked at 3 companies before joining us. At each one, he had implemented streamlining initiatives focused on financial controls. Each company had experienced significant financial issues within a year of his departure. One had restated earnings due to accounting irregularities. Another had written off millions in questionable technology investments, and the third had settled a shareholder lawsuit related to inadequate financial oversight. It could have been coincidence, but combined with what was happening at Westfield, it looked more like a pattern. Still, I needed stronger evidence to connect Brian directly to DataSync. I spent the next 3 days researching DataSync solutions, Richard Webb, and anything that might link them to Brian Harper. The breakthrough came when I discovered an SEC filing from 4 years ago showing that Richard Webb and Brian Harper had jointly owned a consulting firm called Harper Webb Advisors that was dissolved shortly before Brian joined Westfield. This wasn't just a CFO cutting corners, this was potentially fraud. Brian had approved a multi-million-dollar contract to a company he had a prior business relationship with, while deliberately concealing that connection and firing the person most likely to discover it. As this realization sank in, my phone rang again. It was Lucas Montgomery. Tanya? I found something you should know, he said without preamble. One of our former developers now works at a company that used DataSync last year. The implementation was a disaster, but the most interesting part is that their CFO at the time was a close associate of Brian Harper. When the project failed, both the CFO and DataSync walked away with substantial payouts. My hands shook as I added this information to my growing file. Lucas, I think Brian and Richard Webb might be running a scheme where Brian gets hired as CFO, dismantles financial controls, pushes through contracts to DataSync, and then they both profit when the projects inevitably fail. That would explain why they're so focused on eliminating verification processes, Lucas agreed. Have you taken this to anyone at Westfield? I hesitated. Not yet. I'm not sure who I can trust. And without solid proof, it would be my word against the CFO who just fired me. Well, you should know that we're not the only vendor not getting paid, Lucas said. I've spoken with 2 others in the same situation. It seems all the regular vendors are on hold while DataSync gets fast-tracked payments. After our call, I sat staring at my evidence file, faced with a difficult decision. Should I risk further humiliation by bringing these allegations forward? Or should I just walk away, update my resume, and let Westfield learn its lesson the hard way? The answer came when I thought about my team, still trapped in a toxic situation, and all the people whose work had gone into building Westfield. They deserved better than to have the company destroyed from within. I had to at least try to expose what was happening, but I needed help from someone with influence. It was time to contact Martin Reynolds. Reaching out to Martin Reynolds felt like a risk. We had been close professionally, but I had no idea if he would be willing to get involved in company matters after his abrupt retirement. Still, he was the only person I could think of who might understand the significance of what I had uncovered and have the credibility to help me. I sent him a carefully worded email requesting a meeting about an urgent matter regarding Westfield's financial integrity. To my relief, he responded within hours, inviting me to his home the following afternoon. Martin's house was a modest ranch-style home in a quiet suburb with a meticulously maintained garden. He greeted me at the door looking thinner than I remembered, but his firm handshake and clear eyes suggested his health might be better than when he left Westfield. "Tanya, it's good to see you," he said, leading me to a sunroom at the back of the house. "Though I'm concerned about the reason for your visit. I heard about your termination. Completely inappropriate, from what I gather. You've kept in touch with people at Westfield?" I asked, surprised. "A few trusted colleagues. I may be retired, but I spent 10 years building that finance department." He gestured for me to sit. "Now, tell me what's happened." I laid out everything chronologically: Brian's arrival, the dismantling of financial controls, the irregular vendor approvals culminating in the data sync contract, my termination, and finally the evidence I had gathered about Brian and Richard Webb's connection. Martin listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. When I finished, he removed his reading glasses with a deep sigh. "I had reservations about Brian Harper from the beginning," he admitted. "His references checked out, but something about him felt off during the interviews. Unfortunately, the board was impressed by his credentials and experience with larger companies." "Did you share your concerns?" I asked. "I tried, but my health issues arose simultaneously with the CFO search. The board attributed my objections to being protective of my department rather than substantive concerns about Brian's suitability." Martin leaned forward. "I need to tell you something in confidence, Tanya. My health issues were real, but exaggerated. I was being eased out." "What?" I was stunned. "But you were essential to Westfield's success. I had been opposing a push from certain board members to accelerate growth through acquisitions and riskier investments. They viewed my conservative approach as an obstacle." He smiled sadly. "Sound familiar?" "When they suggested early retirement with an enhanced package, I saw the writing on the wall and negotiated the best exit I could." This revelation added a troubling new dimension. If Martin had been removed to pave the way for a more aggressive financial approach, had Brian been specifically selected to weaken controls? "Let's examine this data sync contract," Martin said, shifting to the documents I had brought. Together, we analyzed what little information I had been able to gather, and Martin immediately spotted several red flags. "Implementation fees this large up front are highly unusual," he noted. "And these milestones are worded so vaguely that data sync could claim completion without delivering anything substantial." He flipped to another page. "The termination penalties are extraordinarily punitive too. If Westfield tries to cancel, they'd have to pay nearly 70% of the total contract value immediately. It's designed to extract maximum money with minimum accountability," I concluded. "Exactly." Martin nodded grimly. "Have you brought this to Jessica's attention? She's always valued financial integrity. I've tried emailing and calling, but she hasn't responded. According to Zach, she's been traveling extensively for the West Coast expansion. I'm not sure she's fully aware of what's happening internally." Martin considered this. "Jessica's always been more focused on growth and innovation than day-to-day operations. She likely trusted Brian to handle the financial side while she concentrated on expansion." He tapped his fingers thoughtfully on the table. "We need more allies and stronger evidence before approaching her." Over the next week, Martin and I developed a careful strategy. He reached out to former colleagues who might have information, while I continued building our case file with Zach, providing updates from inside Westfield. The picture that emerged was increasingly alarming. Brian and Scott had implemented a payment prioritization system that effectively froze payments to established vendors while fast-tracking anything related to data sync. The software implementation was already 6 weeks behind schedule, yet additional payments continued flowing. Employee concerns were being silenced through intimidation and a few strategic terminations of people who asked too many questions. Meanwhile, I had reached out to Andrea Fuller from HR, who finally agreed to meet me for coffee after initially ignoring my messages. She looked tired and stressed, constantly checking over her shoulder, as if afraid of being seen with me. "It's chaos, Tanya," she admitted. "Finance is in complete disarray. Nobody understands the new systems Brian implemented. Vendors are calling daily about late payments, and morale has cratered." "What about Jessica? Is she aware of what's happening?" Andrea shook her head. "She's been in Seattle and Portland most of the past month, setting up the new offices. Brian has been filtering what reaches her, presenting everything as transitional challenges that he's handling. By the time she's on site, he makes sure everything appears under control." "Has anyone tried to raise concerns directly? After what happened to you? People are terrified." Andrea fidgeted with her coffee cup. "Plus, Brian has been clever about building allies in other departments by approving requests that were previously denied under the old financial controls. Some teams are actually benefiting from the chaos, at least in the short term." Before we parted, Andrea shared a crucial piece of information. The quarterly board meeting is next Thursday. Brian will be presenting his financial transformation results to the full board, including Jessica. He's been preparing for weeks, shaping the narrative to show his changes as successful, despite the actual situation. This news gave us a deadline and a potential opportunity. If we could get our evidence to the right people before or during that meeting, we might be able to expose Brian before he could further entrench himself. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Lucas Montgomery called to inform me that Montgomery Systems still hadn't received payment for 3 months of critical infrastructure services. "We've reached the point where we need to consider suspending services," he said reluctantly. "But before taking that step, I wanted to speak with you. Westfield has been a valued partner for years. Suspending services would cause major disruptions," I noted, seeing a potential leverage point. "Exactly, which is why I've been patient. But I have a business to run too." He paused. "There's something else. I'll be joining a conference call with several Westfield board members tomorrow to discuss a potential expansion of our services for the West Coast offices." My heart raced. "Will Jessica be on that call?" "Yes, along with several board members. Brian Harper will be presenting the financial aspects." This was the opportunity we had been waiting for, a way to get our concerns directly to decision-makers. But we needed to be strategic. "Lucas, what if you mentioned the payment issues during that call? Not accusatory, just as a matter of fact when discussing the expanded services." "I could do that," he agreed. "It would be entirely appropriate in that context. And if questioned, could you mention that multiple vendors are experiencing similar issues?" "Yes, that's just stating facts." "What are you thinking, Tanya?" I explained that we were trying to get Jessica's attention about potential financial irregularities. Lucas agreed to help, without overstating his role. "I can open the door, but you'll need to walk through it," he cautioned. The final piece fell into place when Martin revealed an important connection. I sit on the board of Meridian Health Systems with Thomas Allen, who's also on Westfield's board. He's always been a stickler for proper governance. If anyone would be concerned about what we've uncovered, it's Thomas. Martin arranged a confidential meeting with Thomas for the following evening, just 2 days before the board meeting. We carefully organized our evidence, creating a concise but comprehensive presentation of the pattern of behavior, the Brian data sync connection, and the resulting financial risks to Westfield. As we finalized our preparations, my phone rang with Zach's number. "Tanya, I just overheard something you need to know," he said urgently. Scott Williams was on the phone with someone named Richard. They were discussing how to handle the vendor noise at the upcoming board meeting. Scott said, "Once Brian presents the savings numbers, no one will care about a few delayed payments." Then he mentioned something about Phase 2 starting next month. A chill ran down my spine. Whatever Brian and Richard had planned, it was apparently just the beginning. We were running out of time to stop them. The night before our meeting with Thomas Allen, I received an unexpected call from a blocked number. It was Scott Williams. "Tanya, I think we got off on the wrong foot." He began with artificial friendliness. "Brian can be intense sometimes in his pursuit of efficiency. We've been discussing the situation and feel your departure was perhaps handled poorly." My guard immediately went up. "What do you want, Scott?" "We'd like to offer you a settlement package. 3 months' salary and a positive reference in exchange for signing an NDA about your time at Westfield. Clean break. Everyone moves on." His tone hardened slightly. "The alternative is a documented termination for cause, which might make your job search challenging." The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Somehow, they had gotten wind of our investigation. "I'll need time to consider this," I replied, trying to sound uncertain. "The offer expires tomorrow at noon," Scott countered. "We'll email the paperwork tonight. Think carefully about your future, Tanya." After hanging up, I immediately called Martin. "They're trying to silence me before the board meeting. They must know we're gathering evidence." "This confirms we're on the right track," Martin replied. "And it makes our meeting with Thomas even more critical." I spent a restless night reviewing our documentation one final time, knowing that the next day could determine not just my professional future, but the fate of Westfield itself. The company had given me a chance when others wouldn't. Despite everything that had happened, I couldn't abandon it now. Tomorrow would be our one shot at exposing the truth. Thomas Allen turned out to be exactly as Martin had described him, a distinguished man in his early 60s with piercing blue eyes that missed nothing. We met at his private office after hours, where Martin made the introductions. "Martin speaks very highly of your professionalism, Miss Wilson," Thomas said as we settled into comfortable leather chairs. "I must say, these allegations are deeply troubling. If true." The skepticism in his tone was evident. Here I was, a recently fired employee making accusations against a C-level executive. His caution was understandable. "I appreciate your willingness to hear us out, Mr. Allen," I replied. "Everything I'm about to share is documented and can be verified independently." Over the next hour, we walked Thomas through our evidence, the pattern of dismantled controls, the data sync contract irregularities, the SEC filings showing Brian and Richard's prior business relationship, and the testimonials from vendors experiencing payment delays while DataSync received preferential treatment. Thomas asked penetrating questions throughout, testing our claims and challenging our interpretations. His expression remained neutral, but I noticed him taking extensive notes. When we finished, he sat back and steepled his fingers. "If what you've presented is accurate, this represents a serious governance failure." He turned to Martin. "You believe this goes beyond mere incompetence or poor judgment?" "I do," Martin stated firmly. "The systematic dismantling of controls, the concealed relationship with DataSync, the targeted removal of oversight personnel, these aren't random actions. They follow a pattern we've now traced through 3 previous companies." Thomas nodded slowly. "And tomorrow, Brian will be presenting his financial transformation results to the board, likely painting a rosy picture, despite these issues." "Exactly," I confirmed. "According to our sources, he's prepared a presentation highlighting cost savings from eliminated positions and processes, while downplaying the vendor payment crisis and implementation failures." Thomas studied me for a long moment. "Miss Wilson, what is your objective here? Reinstatement? Compensation? Vindication?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't really considered my personal motivations beyond exposing the truth. Honestly, Mr. Allen, I just want to prevent further damage to Westfield. The people there built something valuable that helps healthcare providers serve patients better. I can't stand by while that's destroyed through fraud or negligence. I met his gaze directly. What happens to me is secondary. Something in my answer seemed to satisfy him. He closed his notebook and stood up. I find your evidence compelling enough to warrant further investigation. Here's what I can do. I'll ensure this information reaches the audit committee before tomorrow's meeting. I cannot promise immediate action, but I can guarantee these concerns will receive proper attention. It wasn't the dramatic intervention I had hoped for, but it was a start. As we were preparing to leave, Thomas added one more thing. It would be helpful to have someone familiar with these issues available during the board meeting tomorrow, should questions arise. Would you be willing to wait in the anteroom, Miss Wilson? My heart leaped. Absolutely. The following morning, I dressed in my most professional outfit and arrived at Westfield headquarters an hour before the board meeting. Security was clearly confused by my presence. I had been escorted out in disgrace weeks earlier, yet now had clearance from a board member to enter the executive floor. Thomas met me briefly to explain the arrangements. You'll wait here, he said, indicating a small conference room adjacent to the boardroom. There's an intercom system so you can hear the proceedings. If we need you, I'll come get you. Has anyone else been informed about our discussion? I asked. Only the head of the audit committee. We agreed to let Brian present his report first, then raise these concerns afterward. It's important that we observe proper governance procedures. As the board members arrived, I glimpsed Jessica for the first time since my termination. She looked tired but energized, likely buoyed by the progress of the West Coast expansion. She had always been focused on growth and innovation, often delegating financial details to others. Had that trust been exploited by Brian? Through the intercom, I could hear the meeting begin with standard formalities. Then Brian was introduced to present his financial transformation update. Board members, I'm pleased to report significant progress in our financial modernization initiative. Brian began confidently. In just 3 months, we've eliminated redundant processes, reduced overhead costs by 16%, and accelerated vendor onboarding by 60%. He continued painting a picture of streamlined excellence, presenting charts showing cost reductions and efficiency gains. There was no mention of vendor payment issues, implementation delays, or staff turnover. Our strategic partnership with DataSync Solutions is revolutionizing our payment processing infrastructure, Brian claimed. While we've experienced some normal integration challenges, we're on track to realize annual savings of approximately $4 million once fully implemented. I clenched my fists, outraged by the blatant misrepresentations. The DataSync implementation was nowhere near on track. It was a disaster that had already cost more than budgeted, with nothing functional to show for it. The presentation continued for 20 minutes, with board members occasionally asking clarifying questions that Brian handled smoothly. Then came the moment we had been waiting for. Before we move to the next agenda item, Thomas Allen interjected, I'd like to address some concerns regarding vendor payments. Several key partners have reported significant delays since our process changes. Brian barely missed a beat. Yes, we've experienced some temporary processing delays during the transition. That's normal with any system change of this magnitude. We're addressing those issues proactively, including the 3 months of unpaid invoices to Montgomery Systems, Thomas pressed. Brian's expression tightened slightly. That specific case involves some contract compliance questions we're working through. Nothing unusual. At that moment, the conference room door opened, and a woman I didn't recognize poked her head in. Lucas Montgomery has joined the call as requested, she whispered to me. On the intercom, I heard Jessica speak up. Lucas, thank you for joining us. I understand there have been some payment issues? Yes, Jessica. Lucas's voice came through clearly. Montgomery Systems hasn't received payment for 3 months of services, despite numerous inquiries. We're not the only vendor in this situation. This is the first I'm hearing about this, Jessica said, confusion evident in her voice. Brian quickly intervened. As I was explaining, we're working through some verification processes. Standard procedure when implementing new payment systems. That's not accurate, Lucas countered calmly. There have been no verification requests or communications about disputed invoices. Just silence and delays. This is highly unusual in our 5-year partnership with Westfield. The tension in the boardroom was palpable even through the intercom. I heard papers shuffling before Jessica spoke again. Brian, why wasn't I informed about these payment issues? Montgomery Systems provides critical infrastructure for our operations. It's been handled at the departmental level, Brian replied, his confident tone beginning to waver. I didn't want to trouble you with operational details during your focus on the expansion. Thomas seized the opening. While we're discussing data sync solutions, I'd like to raise another concern. Did you disclose your prior business relationship with DataSync's founder when recommending this contract? A heavy silence fell over the room. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Brian finally responded, his voice noticeably tighter. The SEC filing showing you and Richard Webb as co-owners of Harper Web Advisors until shortly before you joined Westfield, Thomas clarified. That relationship should have been disclosed as a potential conflict of interest before approving a $2.8 million contract. I've known Richard professionally for years, Brian admitted. But that old consulting firm was dissolved before I joined Westfield. There's no active conflict. Lucas's voice cut in. If I may add something relevant, Richard Webb approached Montgomery Systems last year about a partnership. Our due diligence revealed concerning business practices, including a pattern of failed implementations, followed by substantial remediation fees. We declined the partnership. The room erupted with multiple voices asking questions simultaneously. Through the chaos, I heard Jessica call for order. Brian, did you know about DataSync's track record before approving this contract? She demanded. Their references checked out. He insisted defensively. Every implementation has challenges. The long-term benefits outweigh any temporary issues. And firing our financial controls manager for questioning these payments, was that also for long-term benefits? Thomas asked pointedly. Another silence fell. I could almost picture Brian squirming under the combined scrutiny. Personnel decisions were made based on performance and adaptability concerns, he finally stated. I think we need more clarity on this situation, Jessica said, her voice now hard with authority. Thomas, you mentioned having additional information? This was the moment. The conference room door opened, and Thomas appeared. Tanya, the board would like to hear from you directly. Walking into that boardroom was one of the most intimidating moments of my professional life. 8 board members plus Jessica sat around a massive table, with Brian and Scott at one end looking like cornered animals. On a large screen at the front of the room, Lucas Montgomery watched from his office. Miss Wilson, thank you for joining us, Jessica said, her expression unreadable. I understand you have information relevant to these financial control issues. Taking a deep breath, I presented the evidence we had compiled calmly, factually, and without accusation or emotion. I explained the systematic dismantling of financial controls, the irregular vendor approvals, and the documented connection between Brian and DataSync. I shared Zach's reports about continued preferential payments despite implementation failures, and finally, Scott's attempt to silence me with an NDA just before this meeting. Throughout my presentation, Brian and Scott exchanged increasingly panicked glances. When I finished, Brian immediately went on the offensive. This is obviously a vindictive campaign by a terminated employee, he declared. Miss Wilson was resistant to necessary changes from day one. Her accusations are exaggerated and taken out of context. Lucas spoke up from the screen. If I may, I have something relevant to share. He held up a document to his camera. This is an email from Richard Webb to Brian Harper, dated 2 months ago, discussing how to accelerate the payment schedule before questions arise. It was accidentally included in a documentation packet sent to our technical team during integration testing. Brian's face drained of color. That's not what it appears to be. I think it's exactly what it appears to be, Jessica said quietly. Her calm tone was more devastating than anger would have been. Brian, Scott, please step outside while the board discusses this matter. They left without another word, Brian glaring at me as he passed. Once they were gone, Jessica turned to me. Tanya, I owe you an apology. I've been so focused on expansion that I failed to properly oversee these changes. You tried to alert us to problems and paid a heavy price for doing your job. She looked genuinely distressed. I should have been more accessible. We all share responsibility for inadequate oversight, Thomas added. The governance failure here extends beyond any individual. For the next hour, I answered the board's detailed questions about the financial control systems that had been dismantled, the vendor verification process, and the specific red flags in the data sync contract. By the time we finished, the path forward was clear to everyone in the room. Jessica's assistant entered to whisper something in her ear. Jessica nodded before addressing the board. Security has informed me that Brian and Scott were observed attempting to access restricted financial systems and have been detained. I recommend we move directly to a vote on their termination and the formation of an investigation committee. The vote was unanimous. In a matter of minutes, the 2 men who had upended my career were removed from the company they had attempted to defraud. As the meeting concluded, Jessica asked me to stay behind. When we were alone, she looked at me with newfound respect. Tanya, I hope it's not too late to ask you to help us fix this mess. Tanya, I hope it's not too late to ask you to help us fix this mess. Jessica's words hung in the air between us, both an apology and an opportunity. After everything that had happened, the public humiliation, the weeks of uncertainty, the stress of building our case, I found myself at a crossroads I hadn't anticipated. What exactly are you proposing? I asked carefully. Jessica gestured for me to sit as she gathered her thoughts. I want to offer you your position back, but that seems inadequate given the circumstances. What happened revealed serious flaws in our oversight and governance. She met my eyes directly. I'd like you to return as Vice President of Financial Integrity, reporting directly to me while we search for a new CFO. You would have full authority to rebuild the controls that were dismantled and lead the investigation into Brian and Scott's actions. The offer was more than I had expected, a significant promotion with expanded responsibilities and direct access to the CEO. Still, I wasn't ready to accept immediately. I appreciate the offer, Jessica, but I need to understand what resources and authority would come with this role. The problems went beyond just Brian and Scott. There were systemic issues that allowed this to happen. Jessica nodded, respecting my caution. You'd have budget for additional team members, authority to review and revise all financial policies, and a seat at the executive leadership table. She leaned forward. I'm also proposing a new board-level finance and audit committee with direct oversight of financial controls, which you would work with closely. Thomas Allen has agreed to chair it. This addressed one of my key concerns, the need for structural changes to prevent similar situations in the future. What about data sync and the other irregular vendors? Effective immediately, all payments to data sync are frozen pending legal review. We'll need your help unwinding that contract and assessing the actual damages. Jessica sighed. And we need to make things right with our legitimate vendors as quickly as possible. Over the next hour, we negotiated the details of my return. I insisted on bringing in an external auditing firm to review all transactions from the past 3 months, authority to rebuild my team with appropriate compensation adjustments, and a clear communication to the entire company about what had happened and the steps being taken to address it. By the time we finished, I had accepted the position of Vice President of Financial Integrity with expanded responsibilities and a significant salary increase. But more importantly, I had Jessica's commitment to meaningful structural changes. As I left the boardroom, Lucas Montgomery's face was still on the video screen. He gave me a thumbs up and a smile before the connection ended. Outside, Martin was waiting anxiously. "How did it go?" he asked. "Brian and Scott have been terminated. I've been offered a new position to fix the mess they created." I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. "And it looks like your health issues might be improving enough for you to serve as a special advisor during the transition, if you're interested." Martin laughed. "I might be persuaded to make a partial comeback. Someone needs to help clean up this mess." The following weeks were among the most challenging and rewarding of my professional life. The investigation revealed that Brian and Richard's scheme was even more extensive than we had initially suspected. They had implemented similar fraudulent arrangements at 2 other companies, resulting in millions of dollars in misdirected funds. Both men were now facing criminal charges and civil litigation. At Westfield, the work of rebuilding began immediately. My first priority was reaching out to our legitimate vendors, including Montgomery Systems, to explain the situation and establish payment plans for outstanding invoices. Lucas was understanding and became a valuable ally in restructuring our vendor management system. "You know, there's a silver lining to this whole debacle," he told me during a planning meeting. "It's forcing every company in the industry to look at their own controls more carefully. Several of my other clients have asked for reviews of their verification processes since this story started circulating. Internally, I faced the challenge of rebuilding trust with a demoralized finance department. Many felt guilty for not speaking up sooner or supporting me when Brian attacked my work. I made it clear from day one that we were looking forward, not backward. What happened was a failure of systems, not just individuals," I told them during our first department meeting. "We're going to build something better together, incorporating what we've learned from this experience." I reinstated the core financial controls that had been dismantled while working with each team to identify legitimate improvements for efficiency. The new processes we developed together were actually stronger than the ones they replaced, maintaining rigorous verification while eliminating unnecessary steps that had accumulated over time. Zach Thompson received a well-deserved promotion for his courage in providing critical information during the investigation. Andrea from HR became a close partner in rebuilding company culture around transparency and ethical standards. The most profound change came in my working relationship with Jessica. Our weekly one-on-one meetings evolved into thoughtful discussions about balancing growth with appropriate controls. She became more engaged in financial oversight while still driving the company's innovative vision. "I've always been focused on where we're going, sometimes at the expense of how we get there," she admitted during one of our sessions. This experience has been a powerful reminder that the path matters just as much as the destination. 6 months after the boardroom confrontation, Westfield hosted a financial leadership summit for our industry, sharing the lessons we had learned about fraud prevention and control systems. I was asked to deliver the keynote address, with Martin and Lucas joining me for a panel discussion afterward. The event solidified Westfield's renewed reputation for integrity and became an annual tradition that raised standards across the industry. 1 year after my return to Westfield, I stood at the front of our largest training room, facing 20 new financial professionals during their orientation. The company had not only recovered but was thriving, with our West Coast expansion proceeding on solid financial footing and a new CFO who fully supported strong controls alongside strategic growth. The most important asset in finance isn't software or systems or even expertise, I told the attentive group. It's integrity. Technology changes, regulations evolve, markets shift, but the fundamental commitment to doing the right thing remains constant. Sometimes that means being the voice that asks uncomfortable questions when everyone else is silent. Sometimes it means standing your ground when it would be easier to look the other way. I shared the story of what had happened not to dwell on the past, but to illuminate the principles that now guided our work. As I concluded, I noticed Jessica standing at the back of the room, listening with a smile of approval. The true measure of financial leadership isn't found in cost-cutting or process efficiency, though those have their place, I said. It's found in the courage to protect what matters most. The trust that others place in us when they invest their money, their careers, and their futures in our hands. That trust is hard-earned, easily lost, and worth fighting for every single day. After the session, Jessica approached as the new employees filed out. Powerful message. You've transformed how we think about financial oversight in this company. We've transformed it together, I corrected her. It took all of us. You, the board, the finance team, even our vendors to build something better from that crisis. She nodded thoughtfully. Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't stood your ground that day with Brian? The question gave me pause. Sometimes. But I try not to dwell on it. I prefer to focus on what we've built since then. Well, I'm grateful every day that you had the courage to fight for what was right, Jessica said, squeezing my arm before heading to her next meeting. As I watched her go, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The path hadn't been easy or straightforward. There had been moments of doubt, fear, and exhaustion along the way. But standing up for what was right, despite the personal cost, had ultimately led to something better than I could have imagined, not just professional vindication, but the opportunity to create lasting positive change. The true lesson wasn't that honesty always prevails, or that justice is guaranteed. The real insight was simpler and more profound. Our integrity is tested not in easy moments of clear choices, but in the difficult situations where doing the right thing comes at a personal cost. In those moments, the decision to stand firm isn't just about rules or processes, it's about who we choose to be and the kind of world we want to create together. Have you ever faced a situation where standing up for what's right came with a personal cost? What gave you the courage to persevere despite the challenges? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find inspiration in Tanya's journey. Thank you for joining me today. And remember, integrity isn't just a policy. It's a practice we choose every single day.